Hello, today we are going to be talking about politics, populists, and progressives, Chapter 20, from the years 1880 to 1917. Now, during this time period of 1880 to 1917, there were also many other major events, specifically World War I, that we will talk about later. So those will be later, but for today we're going to focus in on politics, populists, and progressives. Now, the reform visions of 1880 to 1892. The electoral politics after Reconstruction. Remember, Reconstruction is rebuilding of the South after the Civil War. Well, politics were very unstable, specifically in the South. There was this disillusionment. People weren't happy with some of the policies, and there was more people now being able to vote. There were more immigrants coming over in the elections of 1880, 1884, and 1888. There were presidential elections where they would win the Electoral College, but not the popular election. And we've had that more recently in some of our elections, and it leads to some controversy. And all of these elections were pretty close. So, for instance, in 1880 we have Garfield. In 1884 we have Cleveland, and in 1888 we have Benjamin Harrison becoming president. Now, the electoral politics, how politics changed after this Reconstruction. We had this thing called the Gilded Age. Basically, it's this idea that everything was covered in gold. It's kind of a representation. Everybody thought things were better than they really were. Politics were corrupt and stagnant. They weren't progressing. As it said, this Gilded Age, it's a glittery outer coating of prosperity, but underneath suffered from moral decay. There were a lot of problems. You have James Garfield in the spoils system. He basically gave his friends jobs, and he was assassinated. And because of this, now we have the Pendleton Act and an exam in order to work for the government. You have the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was an attempt to forbid combination in the form of trust or otherwise, or conspiracy and restraint of trade. As far as major businesses joining together and working together, they were trying to work on that and overcome that. For instance, here you have the Standard Oil Company, which was a monopoly and a large trust, and so the Sherman Antitrust Act was trying to go after it. They basically would reach out. Here they're representative of a octopus reaching out and grabbing up all these smaller companies and stealing them up, and it's something that we have talked about in class. Here we also have the Populist Party. In July 1892, the People's Party, or also known as the Populist Party, they grasped onto a lot of different groups and organizations, and a lot of people kind of turned to them. It was the political party of the people. They wanted stronger government to protect ordinary Americans. So you have some distrust. Those elections, you don't really have the best of presidents being elected during this time. You have problems politically. You have different political parties and all this drama that is happening. Now, there were some major issues with politics in the 1890s. In 1893, we have a severe economic depression. And in an economic depression, the value of money goes down. People lose jobs. People are getting paid less money. You have farms and railroads, and they are going to foreclose, meaning they're no longer going to exist, which is going to cause more problems, because now if there's less food, there's less railroads. It impacts many other facets of the society, and this is going to lead to that economic depression of 1893. And ultimately, when there is a depression, banks start to close, and when a bank closes, people lose money. People can't borrow money. People can't protect their money, and it leads to even more issues. Now, there were some soldiers who were promised some money. They fought in the Civil War and said, you know, if you fight in the war, we will give you money at this time. They needed that money in order to survive, so they marched on Washington looking for jobs. They were arrested. They're known as the Coxey Army. President Cleveland felt strongly about staying on the gold standard. Now, this gold standard, as we've mentioned in class, is this idea that for every $1 of paper money, you have equal amount of gold. So if I had $500 in my wallet right now, I could go to a bank and trade it out for $500 worth of gold. It's a good idea, but it's not practical if you want the economy to grow, because eventually there's going to be more and more money. The value of it's going to go up, and it's not going to be able to equal the amount of gold that there is on hand. Cleveland reached out to J.P. Morgan which was a financial guy. He had a lot of money because the federal government was almost broke. So J.P. Morgan ended up loaning a single individual and his company loaned the government money to be able to make sure that the government wouldn't fail. Democrats in the South, the solid South, the populace in the South went after African American votes, kind of replaced the Republicans after Reconstruction. Democrats in the South were known as the white man's party. Here we have a quote from Ben Tillman of South Carolina. He said, "We've done our level best to block every last black vote. We stuffed ballot boxes. We shot them. We are not ashamed of it." Sorry about the spelling mistake. "We had to do it. Those whatevers, populists would have ruined the country." So here we have an example of this guy admitting to many laws that were broken, all in the name of trying to get their vote. In Mississippi in 1890, there was what was known as an understanding clause. You had to be able to understand the Constitution in order to be able to vote. Williams v. Mississippi in 1898 said that the grandfather clause was out, meaning before this time, if your grandfather didn't vote, you couldn't vote. And obviously for majority of the African Americans, their grandfathers did not vote. But poll taxes and literary tests could stay. So you would have to pay a tax or be able to pass a literacy test, and I'll show you those in just a minute. There was disenfranchisement increased, meaning the percentage of people voting dropped from 70% down to 34%, predominantly among African Americans. The racial climate in the South got worse. There were more segregation laws. There was open lynching in front of crowds, and I will show you a picture of that here in just a second. And in the solid South, the Democrats exercised almost complete control. Despite the populace and their try to incorporate and include more African Americans in the political process, the Democrats basically would not allow any of that. Here we can see a poll tax up on the top. This poll tax would be a total of $2.50. Now, to you and I, that may not be much today, but if you put that in today's money, let's just say it'd be $400. You have to pay $400 in order to vote. And if you were a freed slave or you were in sharecropping, you didn't have that kind of money. Or there on the bottom is the state of Louisiana literacy test. Okay, so like number 1, draw a line around the number or letter of the sentence. Okay, so is that you draw a line around? Is that number 1? Shouldn't it just be draw a circle? And number 2, draw a line under the last word in this line. Number 3, cross out the longest word in this line. Number 4, draw a line around the shortest word in this line. Number 5, circle the first letter of the alphabet in this line. Good luck. Here we can see disenfranchisement, people not specifically African Americans not being able to vote. Now, here is a picture of the lynching. So if you don't want to see it, skip ahead for the next few seconds. It was a postcard, and I want you to be able to think about a couple things. You know, who is in the crowd, who is not in the crowd, what are their facial expressions, why would they photograph this, why would this image be taken with the body? And his name was Lige Daniels. He's seized from a jail by a mob who broke down the prison door to kidnap and kill him. So if you don't want to see it, here it is. Skip forward about 30 seconds or so, and you won't have to see it. This is in Center, Texas in 1920. There you can see, I want you to look at the faces, the ages of the people in the crowd. What gender is there, what gender is not. And why do you think they would feel so inclined to put this on a postcard? Here we can see the postcard. This is where they lynched a Negro the other day. They don't know who done it. I guess they don't care much. I don't. Do you? That was the back of the postcard. Now, new national realities. The Populist Party is ultimately on its way out. 1896 presidential election, we have William McKinley, who wins as a Republican. You can see he gets 61% of the electoral votes and only 51% of the popular vote. The electorate narrowed to favor native-born and wealthy. So they want to favor the people that live close by and are financially well-to-do. Here you have the 17th Amendment that's ultimately going to get passed in 1913 that says senators are elected by the people, a big change. Now, there were some reforms that were reshaping things between 1901 and 1912. You had Theodore Roosevelt as president. McKinley is assassinated after only 6 months in office, and Roosevelt was the governor of New York. Ultimately, Roosevelt's going to become president. This is Teddy Roosevelt, not Franklin D. Roosevelt later on. Um, Roosevelt wanted vigorous reform. From his days in New York, he knew what was going on with economics and big businesses, and it was a major shift for Republicans. He was all for this antitrust legislation. So think of the Standard Oil image that we saw earlier. You know, he was against companies like that. The Supreme Court began to dissolve monopolies. Teddy went bear hunting in 1902 in Mississippi. That's why he got the name Teddy Bear. He was a great president. He established national parks and wildlife refuges, environmental action, and eventually he decided to retire. In 1908, he retired, and then we had President Taft, who came in as president number 27. So here we have a newspaper. Extra: President McKinley assassinated, shot twice in the stomach and groin, happened at the Pan American in the Temple of Music. Okay, here we have Teddy Roosevelt down here at the bottom. If we look here, we can be able to see Teddy Roosevelt down here. And what's great about this is it says here, this cartoon from Puck shows Theodore Roosevelt as a tiny figure with a sword marked public service. It's a little hard to see. Taking on railroad developer Jay Gould, financier John J.P. Morgan, and other Wall Street titans. The figure at the top right is oil magnate John D. Rockefeller. In its reference to the folktale Jack the Giant Killer, the cartoon suggests how difficult it will be for the president to limit the power of globally connected bankers and financiers. So here he is taking on these big businesses, these big powerful men, and trying to break them up. There we got a nice picture of Roosevelt. Now, the diverse progressive goals. The urban movement called attention to poverty in industrial cities. People started to realize, hey, there's some problems here in our cities and in our towns, and we need to work on fixing that. It resulted from miserable and unjust social conditions. You had the National Child Labor Committee, which recruited Lewis Hine in 1907, who went out and was a photographer. He photographed the mines and the mills where these young children were working so that it would bring awareness to people and say, hey, look what is happening to these people. You have Mueller v. Oregon, which is limiting women's workday to only 10 hours a day. Not men. Women are seen as potential mothers, and so they're trying to make it a little more accommodating for these women / mothers to be able to be at home as well. Women's organizations started to lobby for reforms. They said, or provided assistance to single mothers, whether their husbands had died or ran off or whatever. They also wanted to establish a minimum wage for women. So here we have Lewis Hine and some of his photographs. Here we can see a young girl working in some sort of mill making clothing. Here we can see a young boy selling newspapers on a street corner. Here we can see another young boy, probably works in a mill, a mine. You can see he's dirty. Probably been a long day for him. And here we have a young boy working in some sort of food factory. Looks like some canned food there, and that he is moving around. In 1905, you have a man by the name of W.E.B. Du Bois, African-American man, establishes a meeting at Niagara Falls, the Canadian side. The reason why in 1905 this had to be in the Canadian side is there's still not equality for African Americans. And so here he is having this meeting, and he is calling for full voting rights for all. He wants an end to segregation. He wants equal treatment amongst blacks and whites in courts. He wants equal opportunity amongst blacks and whites in education, jobs, healthcare, military, service. You know, the war's been done for 50 years, a little less than 50 years or so, the Civil War. They've been, the African Americans have been freed, but there's still these inequality issues. And so here he is trying to fight for it. These principles guided the civil rights movement all the way up through the 20th century. Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, those big names that we're familiar with. These are the same things they were fighting for in the later 1900s that they were fighting for in the early 1900s. In 1909, there was an organization called the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. It's called the NAACP. It's still around today, created in 1909, and it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a national association, so a group throughout all of America that wanted the advancement of colored people to happen. that full voting rights, the end to segregation, the equal treatment in courts, the opportunity in education and jobs and those things. Here you have W.B. Du Bois. There you have the logo for the NAACP. President Taft, no good, not really accomplishing much. Roosevelt got back from a year-long safari in Africa, and Roosevelt runs for president. But there's a little bit of problem with this. Roosevelt's not picked by the Republican Party, so he started what's known as the Progressive Party, or the Bull Moose Party. And so only the Democrats, Woodrow Wilson, were doing anything for African Americans. With the progressives and the Republicans kind of fighting against each other for votes, Wilson ends up receiving 82% of the electoral votes. Wilson wins. President Wilson here starts something, the New Freedom, between 1913 and 1917. He wants some economic reforms. So there's a progressive income tax, which ultimately is called the 16th Amendment. There is the Federal Reserve Act, a banking system more resistant to such crisis. So this is pre-Great Depression of the 1930s, but we'd learned from that economic depression of the late early 1890s, and so here he is helping the banks be stronger so that those types of things weren't happening. Monopolies, he says, were not efficient. They're less competition, and so he's trying to do away with those. By 1915 and 16, Wilson passed bills to benefit American workers, trying to make life better for everyone. But but ultimately he didn't really do much of anything for African Americans. Now, that is this government. We have a lot of problems with the government between these dates of 1880 and 1917, whether it's a bunch of different presidents, not very efficient presidents, all sorts of different problems, and we've gone over them and some ideas that some of them had to try to make America better.